So, so we can begin, and I guess if other people join, they'll join partway through. So we'll begin, as usual, with prayers, and then we'll do some meditation related to something we talked about last week, but didn't have a chance to meditate on. So while reciting the prayers, if you can, imagine the Buddha in the space in front of you, completely made of light, the whole visualization transparent and radiant. The Buddha's sitting on a lotus and sun and moon discs, body of golden light, wearing the saffron robes of a monk. Hand on the right knee, right hand on the right knee touching the earth, left hand in the lap holding a bowl filled with medicinal healing nectar to cure our delusions, our afflictions. His face is peaceful and smiling, with an expression of great compassion and great love for all sentient beings throughout the universe, not excluding anybody, not having the slightest anger, aversion, dislike, judgmentalness towards any sentient being. Similar to the kind of love and compassion good parents have for their children, just being totally dedicated to their welfare and doing whatever they can to bring them happiness and relieve their suffering. So that's like the attitude Buddha has towards every one of us. He's completely dedicated to taking care of us, helping us become free of suffering and its causes, helping us achieve genuine peace and happiness and their causes, all the way up to the highest happiness of enlightenment. So just do the best you can to visualize the Buddha. If it's difficult to visualize, don't worry. You can just have the feeling that the Buddha is there. And imagine that one figure of the Buddha representing all the other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and our spiritual teachers, root gurus, lineage gurus, all objects of refuge embodied in that one figure of the Buddha. And as we take refuge and recite the other prayers, you might like to imagine all the sentient beings around you doing the practice along with you and getting the benefit of the practice along with you. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Reverently, I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time, and rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence, and turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of all others to the great enlightenment. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. Imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Now while we recite the mantra of the Buddha, imagine light flowing from the figure of the Buddha in front of you, and it fills your body and mind completely and purifies all that is negative, negative karma, afflictions, obscurations. And the light also nourishes our positive potential, all the good qualities we have in our mind, so they can increase and help us get closer to enlightenment. You can imagine all the other sentient beings surrounding you, also reciting the mantra and receiving the light from the Buddha, purifying and nourishing their positive potential. Tayata Om Mune Mune Maha Manaye Soha. 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 Take a few more minutes to refresh the bodhicitta motivation, the altruistic motivation that you probably generated earlier today. If you didn't do that, you can do it now. So really try to feel that you're here for the benefit of all living beings, learning about the path to enlightenment so that you can practice this path and progress along this path and help sentient beings as much as you can while you're following the path, and then reaching eventually the state of full enlightenment, Buddhahood, so in order to help all sentient beings in the best possible way. So then, spend a few minutes being aware of the breath, your breathing coming in and going out. Make that your focus, your focal object. If other thoughts come along, or you hear sounds that might distract your attention, let go of them, put them aside, and return your attention to the breath. Don't worry if you have to keep doing this again and again. It's the way we train our mind to develop concentration and mindfulness and introspective alertness. So just patiently and gently return your mind, your awareness to the breath every time it wanders away, and just let go of other thoughts, other objects. So last week we started looking at mindfulness of the mind, the third of the 4 establishments of mindfulness. And one way of practicing that is to become aware of when the 3 poisonous states of mind are present in us, and also to know when they are not there. So let's start with attachment, or desire, or greed, or lust, that particular type of mental state. See if you can recall an experience where you did have that in your mind. Your mind was caught up in attachment or desire or lust or greed. If you can remember something recent, a recent experience, it might be helpful, then it's more fresh in your mind. But at any rate, try to recall a time when you did have that in your mind, and remember that experience. Try to bring it up as clearly and vividly as you can. But when you do remember it, try not to get caught up again in the attachment. Instead, try to take a step back so that you can look at that mental state objectively, have a better understanding of it and its quality, what it's like. And remember the faults of attachment. It can be kind of seductive, easy to get caught up in. So it's important that we clearly understand what's wrong with that state of mind. How it's one of the main things that keep us in samsara, circling through death and rebirth and suffering over and over and over again. And also it doesn't see things realistically. It sees the object in an exaggerated way, much more wonderful, fantastic than it really is. And sooner or later that bubble pops and we see the object as it is and realize it's not that great. And then we might become disappointed. We might even have aversion to the object. And then there's the fact of impermanence. The object is impermanent, changing every moment, eventually going out of existence. Attachment too is impermanent. It's not going to last forever. And whatever pleasure, whatever good feelings we get from attachment are not permanent. They last a few moments and then they're gone. So the mindfulness of the mind involves recognizing when our mind is caught up in attachment, when that mental state is present, but also when it's absent. So recall a time when you didn't have attachment in your mind, maybe right now, sitting here in the teaching, sitting quietly, peacefully. Maybe your mind is free of attachment at this moment. So try to recognize that state of mind, a mind that is without attachment, lust, greed. And see if you can recognize that that mental state is more satisfying, more peaceful, more positive, so that you wish to be in that state of mind more and less in the state of mind of having attachment. And now let's do the same with anger. Let's see if you can recall having a mind with anger. Different shades of anger. It can be mild irritation, all the way up to strong rage, and even having thoughts of doing something harmful. So any degree of anger is fine, but just try to recall a time when that was happening in your mind. And don't let yourself get caught up again in that state of mind. Instead, step back from it so that you can look at it objectively. Recognize what that's like, what it's like when the mind is caught up in anger or aversion. And again, remember the faults of that state of mind. It's probably easier to realize that than with attachment, because it's very disturbing, very painful, very unpleasant to be angry. But it also leads to lots of problems. If we act out our anger, we create negative karma, which will bring suffering in the future. But even now, acting out anger can create problems with other people, harm our relationships, hurt other people, and then we feel bad afterwards, feel regret. The teachings also say that anger destroys virtue. We work hard to do virtuous actions, create merit, positive energy, and then one moment of anger can destroy or damage a lot of that hard-earned virtue. And now, see if you can recall a mind without anger. Again, it could be your present state of mind at this point in time. You may not be feeling angry at anybody or annoyed at anybody. Or just try to remember a time earlier today when you had that state of mind. And try to recognize that that is a much more pleasant and comfortable and satisfying, meaningful, beneficial state of mind than the mind with anger. So now, to conclude the meditation, see if you can feel convinced that you wish to have more mental states that are free of attachment and free of anger and other afflictions. But it's also important to be honest and recognize when attachment, anger, and other afflictions are present in the mind. Don't pretend it's not there, because we do need to recognize those states of mind so that we can apply the antidotes and overcome them. So, at the end of our class last week, we were discussing the conventional nature of the mind, which is being clear and cognizant, or clear and knowing. And in the passage from the book Following in the Buddha's Footsteps that I read, His Holiness said that the nature of the mind is neutral, neither virtuous nor non-virtuous. And he said that both constructive emotions as well as destructive emotions are not in the nature of the mind, but they come and go due to causes and conditions. And that idea generated some questions, including in myself when I first came across it. But I think that the meditation that we just did should help us to understand what His Holiness was saying. Because if we look at our experience, we can see that, like with the afflictive emotions, like attachment and anger, they're not always present in our mind. There are times when they're there, but there's times when they're not, when they're absent. And we should be able to see the same with the positive or the constructive emotions. For example, loving kindness. If you ask yourself, is loving kindness always there in my mind, every minute, every second, every day? We'd like to be that way. I know I would. I'd like to have loving kindness every minute, every second, but yeah, sometimes it's not there. And also, if loving kindness was in our mind every minute and every second, we never get angry, because anger and loving kindness are opposite. They can't abide in the mind at the same time. And so, at least towards the same object. So, if we can recognize that there are times when we're angry at a particular person or maybe a number of people, then at that moment it's not possible to also have loving kindness. So loving kindness is absent at that time. And the same with the other positive emotions like compassion and faith and so on. So they also come and go. Sometimes there, sometimes not. So does that make sense? That because both negative emotions or afflictive emotions and the positive emotions, the constructive emotions, they are like transitory, coming and going, like clouds in the sky, and not permanently every minute, every second there in the mind, then they are not in the nature of the mind, meaning they're not always there. But the clear and knowing nature of the mind is something that is always there. And the other day I had a talk with Venerable Children about this. And like, what is this constant clear and knowing nature of the mind if the other factors, the emotions and so on, come and go? And we both thought it's probably the mental consciousness, the primary mental consciousness. Because it does seem that that is always there. There's always mental consciousness, although that doesn't mean it's permanent. Doesn't mean there's this fixed mental consciousness always there in the mind, but rather, of course, it's impermanent, arising and passing, arising, passing. But there's a continuous stream, a continuum of moments of mental consciousness that are continuously going, one after another, and that you know, when we're trying to find the nature of the mind, the clear and knowing nature of the mind, like the Dalai Lama was talking about in the book, that's probably what we're trying to look at and what he was able to recognize. So we were not completely sure, but we thought that's probably it. And also the you know, the sense consciousnesses, the 5 sense consciousnesses, they also come and go. There are times when, well, I don't know, I remember having a discussion about this with one friend who's been studying in the monasteries. In fact, I think he's finished his studies. He's Geshe level. And yeah, and he said that, yeah, all the 6 consciousnesses have their continuum that's there every moment, even if they're not always kind of manifest. I can't remember exactly how that went, but then when we're asleep, the 5 sense consciousnesses don't function. They kind of go dormant. You know, we're not hearing and seeing and smelling and so on during sleep or during unconsciousness, during a coma. But the mental consciousness is always there. That is something that is continuously going day and night. So, does that make sense? Yeah, and it is helpful to understand that the afflictive emotions like anger, attachment, and also ignorance are not always there in the mind, because awareness of that, understanding of that, enables us to understand that they are adventitious. They are temporary, transitory, rather than permanent and fixed. And then that means we can free ourselves from them. They're not permanent fixtures in our mind. And therefore, our mind can be transformed and reach the state of nirvana, the state of enlightenment. And so this is true for ignorance as well. I didn't bring up ignorance in the meditation because I think it's more subtle, more difficult to recognize, easier to recognize attachment and anger, but not always so easy to recognize ignorance. But that too isn't always present. And we might think ignorance is always present because we are told that everything we see appears inherently existing. And when we think about our own self, our I, our body, our mind, when we look at other people, when we look at other things, everything we see, everything we perceive, everything we think about appears as if it's inherently existing or truly existing, which in fact it isn't. So even though we have that experience of seeing everything as inherently existing, that doesn't mean ignorance is there in our mind every moment. What causes this appearance of inherent existence are the imprints of ignorance, the imprints left by ignorance. So those are there in the mind, and those are producing this appearance of inherent existence. But ignorance itself isn't always there. And so in the book Insight into Emptiness by Khenso Jama Tekchok, he talks about this. So he uses this hypothetical situation of a person named Jim. And he says, while Jim is sitting in a relaxing place and reading a book, he simply thinks, I am reading. At this time, what he has in his mind is a valid I-apprehending mind. In other words, just a valid mind seeing I, thinking I. That is manifest. But the I-grasping mind isn't there. The mind that's grasping at an inherently existing I. That is not present. And then suddenly something happens. Someone walks in and insults him or hits him. And so then what happens in Jim is initially there's a moment of the valid I-apprehending mind, and it's followed very quickly by the innate I-grasping. So very quickly the innate mind grasping at an inherently existing I arises, and then due to habit and tendencies, he gets angry. And in that section of the book, he's explaining the difference between a valid conventional mind that apprehends the conventionally existing I. You know, we do have a conventional I, merely labeled I, and we do have a mind or minds that simply apprehend that are simply aware of that. For example, when we think, I am coming, I'm going, I'm eating, I am practicing Dharma. So at those times, we have a sense of an I doing those things. And even though the I appears inherently existing, we aren't necessarily grasping at that appearance. We don't necessarily have manifest ignorance grasping at an inherently existing I. And so he calls that the valid I-apprehending mind. So that's one type of experience we have about our I. And then the other one is ignorance, where we grasp at an inherently existing I. And that's not a valid mind. That's a wrong consciousness. That's ignorance. So that's something that isn't always there. It comes and goes. So it isn't the case that every single thought we have of I is ignorance, grasping at inherent existence. This is a little complicated, but I don't know if it makes sense. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is ignorance, grasping at things as inherently existing, isn't always in our mind every minute, every second. There are times when we just have a sense of ourself, or we see other people, we see other things, and even though everything appears inherently existing, our mind isn't always actively, manifestly grasping at that appearance. as things being inherently existing. So even ignorance isn't in the nature of the mind, a permanent fixture in our mind, but it's something adventitious. But there is still always a mind that is clear and knowing, and it's probably the mental consciousness. And that when we're doing this kind of practice to recognize the nature of the mind, that's probably what we're looking at. And I wanted to say too, so last week I read this section from His Holiness talking about how to recognize the clear and knowing nature of the mind from volume 4, which is Following in the Buddha's Footsteps. And in an earlier volume, volume 2, which is called The Foundation of Buddhist Thought, there's also a passage in there where His Holiness is talking about how to recognize the nature of the mind. And I think it's a little easier to understand. So I thought to read that tonight. So earlier in that book, he explained the terminology clear and knowing, or clear and cognizant. So clear or clarity, the term clarity actually has several meanings. One meaning is that it's non-material. It simply means non-physical, not made of atoms, material particles. So that's one meaning of clarity. So the mind is non-physical. Another meaning of that term is the mind is kind of like a mirror. It works like a mirror in that it reflects objects. So just as a mirror reflects objects that are placed in front of it, they say our mind arises in the aspect of the objects that we perceive or think about. So it's similar to a mirror. And another meaning of the term clarity is that the fundamental nature of the mind is not affected by the defilements like afflictions, that they are not permanent, fixed parts of the mind, but they are adventitious, they can be removed. So the term clarity also refers to that, the possibility of removing the afflictions. The other term in the definition of mind, sometimes translated as knowing or cognizance, and that refers to the mind's ability to engage with objects or to be aware of objects. So that's kind of what the mind does. What the mind does is it knows, or it experiences, it is aware of objects, it engages with objects. And so then His Holiness says, together, clarity and cognizance allow for the appearance of objects to arise and for objects to be known and experienced. So that's what's happening with us 24 hours a day, every minute, every second. Our mind is aware of and knowing, experiencing objects. So then, later in the book, page 167, he talks about how to recognize the mind's nature. So he says, while we may easily say the words, the mind is mere clarity and cognizance, it is difficult to actually have a notion of what the mind is, let alone to perceive its clear and cognizant nature. So I'm glad he said that, because I also find it difficult to really understand what the mind is and be able to see it. Although the clarity and cognizance of the mind are present in every moment of mental activity, we are not aware of them. What prevents this? A consciousness is usually identified in relation to its object, the visual consciousness perceiving blue, or the mental consciousness thinking about a table. When a consciousness engages with its object, it appears in the aspect of that object. Because of the mind's involvement with that object, it is obscured from perceiving the actual nature of the mind. So I think he's saying that we pay more attention to the objects of our awareness, and then because we're involved in the objects, it's harder to see the subject, the mind that is perceiving, experiencing that object. It's more subtle. Objects are easier to recognize, but the subjects are harder to recognize. And then he gives other reasons why it's difficult to see the mind's nature. The mind is usually invaded by a host of constructive and destructive thoughts that concern external objects and people we have perceived or experienced. Does that sound familiar? We have lots of blah, 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 blah in our mind, thinking about things that we've seen and so on. These cloud the clear and cognizant nature of the mind, preventing us from perceiving it. When the flow of thoughts slows down, it is possible to see into the depths of the mind, its clear and cognizant nature that is like a still pool of water. That's a nice analogy. They do sometimes talk about that, like if there's a pool of water. I was thinking about a fountain. In cities they often have a fountain, and if the fountain is going, the water's like that, then it's all very agitated and you can't see the bottom of the fountain. But when the fountain has been turned off and the water's still, then you can see down, and there's pennies and bubble gum wrappers and whatever down on the bottom. So you're able to see it, very clearly when it's calm. So in a similar way, when our mind is agitated by lots of thoughts and memories and emotions and blah, 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 it's very difficult to see the mind's nature. So calming the mind is very important to be able to do that. So he says, one technique for discovering the conventional nature of mind is to prevent the mind from arising in the aspect of those objects and to stop all conceptual thoughts regarding past and future events. To do this, first generate a strong determination not to let your mind be disturbed by sense perceptions, like sounds or thoughts. Let your mind rest without being overrun by sensory perceptions or ideas. At first it may seem that more thoughts than usual arise, but this is not the case. It is simply that in your daily life you do not pay much attention to how many thoughts there are. So we need to be able to stop the usual mental activity of the mind, the thoughts and the memories, and also the attraction to sense objects. Our mind is always kind of running off to things that we see and sounds that we hear and so on. So stopping all that kind of activity. Good luck. I always have trouble doing that, but yeah, if we're in a quiet situation, like in a retreat situation, then it's easier to do. And then he says, continuing to meditate in this way, you will gradually be able to keep the mind at a distance from sense objects, and the barrage of thoughts will diminish and eventually cease. By the mind not arising in the aspect of those objects, the clear nature of mind will become apparent. When you experience your mind in the absence of thoughts about the past and the future, you will have a sense of vacuity, which is the gap between the mind and those objects. So the passage I read last week also talked about a kind of a voidness and a gap, but it wasn't really clear what that gap was. But here he's saying it's the gap between the mind and the objects. Still hard to figure out what that means, but yeah, there is a gap there. And then he says, this vacuity is not the ultimate nature of mind. the mind's emptiness of inherent existence, nor is it nothingness, as in blank-minded meditation. So it's not just spacing out and having a blank mind, but I guess it's just a very clear perception of the nature of mind. Once you experience that vacuous state of mind, try to meditate or remain in it. Eventually you will have a feeling that the mind is something like a mirror with infinite dimensions. At that time, the nature of the mind itself is clear. Yet, whenever the mind contacts an object, a reflection immediately arises. In this way, understand the mirror-like clarity of the mind. The mind remains clear by nature, even though reflections of phenomena may appear in it. So I found that explanation quite beautiful. And His Holiness goes on to say that he was once doing a retreat, a 1-month retreat in Ladakh. And during that time, he got a glimpse of the nature of the mind. And he says he was then able to be aware of when my mind began following a sound or chasing a thought. I could recognize where the mind was going and what was distracting it, as well as when it was at rest, clear and concentrated. But after that 1-month retreat, I resumed my usual busy duties and came back to my original state. Nevertheless, that experience was valuable. So it sounds like we have to be in pretty special circumstances to be able to get this glimpse of the mind's nature, and difficult to do that when we're, even His Holiness says it was hard to maintain that awareness when he was in his usual busy routine. So we shouldn't feel bad if we have difficulty doing it, if even His Holiness. So anyway, that's just a bit more information about one of the things we were talking about last week, one aspect of mindfulness of the mind, explained by His Holiness, that mindfulness of the mind can include being mindful of the conventional nature of the mind, the clear and knowing nature of the mind. And then he also spoke about how mindfulness of mind can help us to understand selflessness. So I just talked a little bit about that last week, and there's a bit more about that. So we may sometimes identify more with our body, like when our body is physically active doing something, we may have more of a sense of I related to our body. But when our mind is more active doing something, then our sense of I may be more connected with our mind. And I was also thinking about Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am. And I think he said that after he was sort of investigating. And it seems that he had doubt about the existence of material things like bodies. Like, how do we know those things are really there? Because we have to use our mind to perceive them. Maybe our mind is fooling us. So he had doubt about material things, but he didn't doubt his own existence because he had thoughts. So it sounds like he was identified very much with his mind, with his thoughts. And in Buddhism, there are some Buddhist schools who say that the mental consciousness is the illustration of the person, the illustration of the I. But as we've heard probably many times, the Prasangikas don't agree with that. They don't agree with saying that an illustration of the I is the mind or the mental consciousness. They say that the mind is part of the basis of imputation for the I, or the person. So the I is imputed on the basis of our aggregates, which includes our mind. And they say that the basis of imputation and the imputed object can't be the same. So since the body and the mind, the aggregates, are the basis of imputation for the I, they cannot be the I. They cannot be the person. And I was thinking kind of absurd consequence of thinking that the basis of imputation was the imputed object would be that as soon as a baby is born, it would already be Kathy or Brian or Stephen or Stacy. The parents wouldn't have to give it a name. The parents wouldn't have to figure out what to name this baby because it comes with a name. It's a name that's already there when it's born. And the same with other things, any object. They already have a name. They don't need to be named. It isn't necessary for human beings to come up with names for things like computer, clock, microphone. As soon as they're made, as soon as they're produced, the name is already there with them. So I think that would be an absurd consequence if you were to think that the basis of imputation was the imputed object, was what it's named. But anyway, that's something that the Prasangikas are very adamant about. They say that the basis of imputation or any part of it cannot be the imputed object. So they say that none of the aggregates, none of the parts of us, body, mind, or parts of the body, parts of the mind, none of those is the I, is the person, but those are just the basis on which the I is designated, is named. So His Holiness says, when we search to find out exactly what the I is, to isolate and identify it as an objective entity with its own independent nature, what do we find? After we have investigated everything, the body, feelings, discriminations, miscellaneous factors, consciousness, those are the 5 aggregates, the collection of those aggregates or something different from the aggregates, we still cannot find an independent person or I. When we search for who the Buddha is, we can't find an inherently existent Buddha. At this point, we discover only the lack of an independent person. The term I exists, and the designated object I exists because we say things like, I am walking, or I am meditating. Yet when we examine exactly what this I truly is, we cannot find it. None of the aggregates is the person. It is in this context that the Buddha said in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras that all phenomena are merely designated independents on their basis of designation, their parts or attributes. Everything exists by name only. Nothing can be found when searched for with ultimate analysis. In this way, mindfulness of the mind prompts us to investigate the ultimate nature of the I and leads us to understand the emptiness of inherent existence of the mind. So this is profound, but this is another way of practicing mindfulness of the mind, connecting it with emptiness, with the investigation into how things exist, especially the I. What is the I? And that can lead us to understand emptiness. Emptiness of the I, but also emptiness of the mind. So, any questions so far? Because we're reaching the end of this section on mindfulness of the mind. Before we... Nabalosan?
When you mentioned the nature of the mind, and you talked about mental consciousness not being always there. That's only the very subtlest levels, right? Because if we go in certain levels of sleep, and like if you faint or something, the grosser consciousnesses are gone. The same at death and through the bardo, it's only the very subtle mental consciousness that carries on. Is that true?
Yeah. I mean, in this section of the book, he wasn't talking in terms of Tantra. It's only in Tantra that they talk about the very subtle mind of clear light. So he wasn't talking about that here. But I would guess that yes, at certain times, like in deep sleep or in a coma or in a faint, yeah, it's probably, I think mental consciousness is still there, it's still functioning, still active, but it probably would be a more subtle level of that than the one we have in our daily life. But it seems to be only, in my experience, it seems to be only in Tantra that they really talk about all those different levels of the mind, the gross and the subtle and the very subtle. So in the sutra system, they don't seem to have such a clear explanation of that. But I think they would still agree that there are more subtle levels of the mind, but it would still be mental. I think, as far as I know, it would still be mental consciousness. Like when a person is in a coma, they may not have any sensory consciousnesses operating, but they still have a mental consciousness. Although there are stories about people who come out of a coma and they can report on things that they've heard while they were in this coma. So I don't know exactly what happens there, what's going on there, but there might be some hearing, audio consciousness going on. But otherwise, it's probably just the subtler level of mental consciousness. I don't know. For me, the mind is still quite mysterious. a lot to learn about it.
I'm curious as to your thoughts on how you would distinguish between blank-minded meditation and just clearing away the thoughts to see the conventional mind. Because we're warned so frequently about not doing blank-minded meditation. So how to not fall into that when you're trying to follow these instructions?
Well, I'm not the person to answer that because when I try to do this kind of meditation to recognize the clear nature of the mind, I always feel like I don't know what I'm doing and I don't know what it looks like and I can't stop my thoughts and so on. So I'm certainly not a person who can give explanation about that. I would imagine His Holiness probably received instructions from his teachers because they do this kind of practice in the Dzogchen tradition, and he has many teachings, many initiations from that tradition. So maybe, my guess is he received special instructions from some of his teachers about how to recognize the clear and knowing nature of the mind. But to just try to do that kind of exploration on your own without instructions, it might be hard to do it right and really get the clear knowing nature of the mind and not something else that isn't that. So that's my thoughts about that it is quite difficult and tricky, and it probably is best to rely on an experienced teacher to help you through that.
I was reading Mingyur's Rinpoche book lately about his wandering retreat, and he was speaking about different instances where you can recognize this gap. You can recognize the nature of the mind. Like, for example, you can train when something's really startled you, and it cuts your train of thoughts. or when you sneeze, then if you bring your awareness to awareness itself, like the mind kind of stop the train of thoughts, and then you can recognize the nature of the mind. So you had different examples like that that I find really funny. Just daily stuff that you can train to, like, yeah, recognize the nature of the mind.
His father was a great Dzogchen master, so I think a little advantage there. Yeah, if we could only be so fortunate.
Venerable, excuse me, Michael Hoffman has a question. Please go ahead, Michael.
Hi, thank you very much for these wonderful teachings. I was very taken with the idea that ignorance is not always present. In other words, I think you use the example of when I'm reading, I'm not necessarily engaging in ignorance. But I guess I find myself wondering, if I'm reading something, am I not actually interpreting the words I'm reading as being inherently existent? Why is reading an example of something that is an absence of ignorance?
Well, this was the example given by Khenso Jamba Tekjok in his book, and he was talking more about the sense of I that we have. And so he used that example of a person who's just sitting there and reading, probably because he's relaxed and not agitated, not in a agitated state of mind. So his state of mind is relatively relaxed, and he just has the sense of sitting there reading, and he's not actively grasping at his I. So he used that example, not talking so much about his apprehension of what he was reading, but his apprehension of his own sense of self or I. So he said at that point in time, he wasn't, strongly grasping at his I being inherently existing. But then, somebody comes along and says something to him and he gets upset, and then the strong grasping arises, grasping at an inherently existing I, and probably thinking, how could you say such a thing to me? How dare you, or whatever, that kind of thing. And so then, his mind changes and goes into that mode of grasping, actively grasping at his I as being inherently existing. So I took that example or that illustration or that simile to mean that the sense of an I, we always, whenever we think of I or have a sense of our I, it always appears inherently existing. We never see our I as anything other than inherently existing I, but our mind isn't always grasping at that, isn't always, believing in that, buying into that. So that's the point he was making. I mean, I don't think he was saying, oh, that doesn't mean Jim isn't ignorant at that point of time. I mean, maybe he's misunderstanding the things that he's reading or ignorant about other things, but he was specifically talking about the ignorance that grasps at an inherently existing I, which is one of the most important types of ignorance we have. That's like the root of samsara, is grasping at our I as being real and solid and objectively existing. So yeah, it's my understanding that even though our mind is very much influenced by ignorance, it isn't the case that that kind of ignorance is always actively present or manifest. There are times when it's, I don't know, some might say it's dormant, it's asleep, it's unconscious. The seeds are there and it can arise at any moment when it's triggered, but it isn't always actively manifest. Does that make sense?
Thank you so much. Very great answer. Thank you.
This is Lama Tsongkhapa's view. I think there may be other masters, other Tibetan masters who would have a different view. But yeah, Lama Tsongkhapa says there are times when we just have an apprehension of things, an awareness of things, but we're not manifestly actively grasping at them as inherently existing. Anyone else? So, Paula, if you could put up the slides. There's one last slide related to mindfulness of the mind. So as with all the other close placements of mindfulness that we looked at, the body and the feelings, so the Buddha talks about contemplating the mind internally and so forth. So this is instructions from the Satipatthana Sutra. So he says, talks about contemplating the mind in and of itself internally. So internally means our own mind. So having mindfulness of our own mind, our own mental states. And then the second point is contemplating mind in and of itself externally. And that means observing others' mental states. So we can't, unless you have clairvoyance, there's this particular ability that some people have, and we can develop it too on the basis of calm abiding and very, very strong concentration. We can develop this ability to see the minds of others and know if they have attachment or if they have anger and so on. But if we don't have that ability, then we can't really see the minds of others. However, we can infer that they have the same kind of mental states that we do. And sometimes we can make a good guess based on their facial expressions, their body language, their behavior. We can kind of guess somebody's angry. It's usually pretty obvious when somebody's angry. Or if they have strong attachment. And sometimes they'll tell us, they say, I'm really angry today. So there are clues we can that can help us understand others' mental states. And just based on the teachings that all of us who are ordinary sentient beings, not enlightened beings, not free of samsara, that we all have these mental states. We all have anger, we all have attachment, we all have ignorance, and doubt, and fear, and so on and so forth. So just contemplating that, understanding that others have those mental states as well. And the positive ones as well. States of mind that are free of anger, or free of attachment, and so on. And then the next one is contemplating mind in and of itself, both internally and externally. So there we alternate between observing one's own mind and observing others' mental states. So these are, as one trains and gains more experience in the practice, these are various stages that you go through, that you develop. Next one says, contemplating the arising and passing away of mind. So this is talking about impermanence. So observing that minds or mental states are impermanent. If we watch our mind very carefully, we can recognize this. We can see that mental states come and go. Fear comes and goes, attachment comes and goes, joy comes and goes, and so on. So they arise and they pass away. Nothing in the mind is permanent, fixed, always there, always the same, but it's always changing. And it says, the next one is contemplating there is a mind. So this means that after gaining familiarity with the various characteristics of different mental states, and you can identify them quickly and easily, then you can just observe the mental process itself with mindfulness. So with a lot of practice, a lot of training, a lot of familiarity, you can just observe different minds arising and passing. And then through this you can abide without clinging. So that's the last point. Abiding freely, not clinging to anything in the world. So those are the Buddha's last words, last instructions on mindfulness of the mind. And just a bit more from the book, Following in the Buddha's Footsteps, what His Holiness says. So he says, mindfulness of the mind develops naturally from mindfulness of feeling, the previous one, because based on the 3 types of feelings, the 3 poisonous mental states arise. So the more familiar we are with our feelings, pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, neutral feelings, then that will help us become more aware of when, as a result of a pleasant feeling, attachment, desire arises. As a result of an unpleasant feeling, aversion, anger, hatred arises. Again, neutral feelings are more difficult, ignorance is more difficult to recognize, but with greater practice, then those can be recognized as well. And then he says, mindfulness of the mind protects the mind from automatically generating afflictions in response to worldly feelings. So the more we can generate this awareness of the mental processes, we'll be in a better position to stop the mind from going down those roads of attachment, aversion, and so forth. And then he says, as we meditate on the above 3 establishments of mindfulness, we go from the coarse to the subtle. The body, that's the first of the 4 objects. The body is a coarse object of contemplation. And then our internal feelings of pain and pleasure are more subtle. The neutral nature of the mind without feelings of pain and pleasure is still subtler. So the 4 objects of mindfulness, body, feelings, mind, and then phenomena kind of become progressively more subtle. And then there's some final instructions on how to practice it. So he says, as with mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of mind can be done either as a temporary practice or as a main practice. When our primary meditation object is not the mind, it is breathing, feelings, and so on, then we are mindful of the mind in order to prevent non-virtuous mental states from taking over or becoming habitual. So when we're doing other kinds of practice, like mindfulness of the breathing or mindfulness of the feeling, we can still pay attention to what kind of mental states are arising. And if we notice strong attachment arising or strong aversion arising, then practice mindfulness of that and stop that state of mind from progressing further. When mindfulness of the mind is the main practice, we may begin the meditation session by observing the breath to settle the mind, and then turn our mindfulness to the mind itself, observing whatever mental state is present without clinging to it or pushing it away. So it sounds like there's various ways that you can practice each of the 4 close placements of mindfulness. You can choose one of them as your main practice, and then use the others as auxiliary, it's hard to say. Like, for example, if you're meditating on mindfulness of the mind, but your mind just is really agitated, really disturbed, it could be helpful to do mindfulness of the breathing for a while to calm the mind down, and then you can go back to observing the mental states. So you can, focus on one as your main object and then use the others to complement it when necessary. And this winter, the winter retreat here in the Abbey, we'll be doing retreat on the 4 establishments of mindfulness. So that means we'll have 3 months to do this practice. And so you could choose to spend some time on one, start with the first one and get familiar with that one, and then spend some time on the second one, and so on. But go back to the earlier ones when you find that helpful, like using the breath to calm down the mind when it's agitated. Okay, so tonight then I'd like to move on to the 4th object of establishments of mindfulness, which is phenomena. We'll just get started on this tonight and probably need to continue next week. So this is the 4th of the 4 establishments of mindfulness. And the word phenomena is a translation of the Sanskrit word dharma, or chu in Tibetan. And that term has many different meanings. Like the most common meaning of dharma, we use it to talk about the Buddhist teachings, we study dharma, we practice dharma, and so on. But that term dharma can have other meanings as well, one of which is simply phenomena, things that exist. And so a phenomenon is simply something that exists. So whatever exists is a phenomenon. But then, how do we know if something exists or not? Because people do sometimes believe in things that don't actually exist, and they can be like 100% certain that they do exist, even though they don't. So in the Buddhist texts, the philosophical texts, they have a definition of an existent, and it's that which is realized by a valid cognition. And a valid cognition is a mind that is incontrovertible, meaning it knows its object correctly as it is. It's able to lead to certainty about the object. I know it. And it eliminates superimpositions about the object. It clears away any doubts or mistaken ideas about the object. So if something can be realized by a valid cognition, that means it's existent, it exists. But if there's no valid cognizer that can realize it, then it doesn't exist. So that's the criteria to know if something exists or not. But that doesn't mean that for something to exist, everybody has to have a valid cognition of it. It just needs to be one, at least one. So for example, emptiness, there's a lot of talk in Buddhist teachings about emptiness, and there are people, there are beings who have a valid cognizer of emptiness, like the Buddha and the Aryas, those who've directly realized emptiness. So they have valid cognizers of emptiness. But us ordinary beings don't. We don't have, at least we don't have a direct realization. Some ordinary beings can have an inferential valid cognizer of emptiness, which is a valid cognizer. It's just not a direct one. But many of us, probably the majority of people in the world, don't even have that. We hear about emptiness, we think about it, we try to understand it, but we probably don't have a valid cognizer of it. So even though we don't have a valid cognizer of emptiness, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Because there are beings who do have that. So anyway, phenomena are things that exist, that can be known by a valid cognizer. So even though the term phenomena refers to all things that exist, in this context of the four establishments of mindfulness. The mindfulness of phenomena refers to just certain phenomena rather than all phenomena. But what those phenomena are, there are different versions, different explanations of that. So Jetsun Chokyi Gyaltsen, the textbook author of Sangye Monastery, so in his commentary to the Ornament for Clear Realization, he says that here phenomena refers to, there's a list of things, all the mental factors other than feeling, because feeling was already one of the four close placements of mindfulness, number 2. So feeling is a mental factor, but there's lots of other mental factors besides feeling. So those are included here in phenomena. And also permanent phenomena, so all permanent things like emptiness and mental images, or also known as conceptual appearances. So these things that appear to our mind when we think or remember things have concepts. And also abstract composites. That's the third type of impermanent phenomena. So all impermanent phenomena fit into 3 categories. Minds is one, form, physical phenomena, and then abstract composites are impermanent things that are neither mind nor form. So they include things like a person. Persons are abstract composites. Time. What else? Other examples of abstract composites. Imprints, mental imprints. The weather. Huh? Season. Yeah, they say spring, winter, autumn. Those are abstract. Numbers. So they're phenomena. They exist, and they're impermanent, but they're neither mind, nor are they physical matter. So that's, they're put into this other category, abstract composites. So this list here that he gives of what's included in phenomena here in this 4th foundation of mindfulness seems to be all things that exist that weren't already covered by the first 3 of the close placements of mindfulness. So the first one is the body, and I'll talk about this later, but the way he explains the body, it includes not just our physical body, but includes all form, all material things. And then feelings, the mental factor of feelings, and then minds, mental states, which he says are mainly the 6 types of mental consciousness. So those are already covered in the first 3 types of close placement of mindfulness. So it seems like everything else that wasn't already covered by those first 3 is included here. And Lama Tsongkhapa wrote a commentary to the Ornament of Clear Realization called the Golden Rosary. And in his commentary, he says that the main phenomena to be mindful of here are factors to be adopted and abandoned on the path. So, for example, afflictions are things to be abandoned on the path. And then beneficial qualities like mindfulness, concentration, are things to be cultivated. So that's how he explains mindfulness of phenomena. Things to be abandoned, things to be cultivated on the path. And it's said in our tradition that this 4th close placement of mindfulness is correlated with the 4th truth, true paths. Because by practicing this close placement of mindfulness, we engage in true paths, meaning the paths that will lead us to liberation and enlightenment. So Lama Tsongkhapa's explanation is quite compatible with the way it's explained in the Pali tradition, which has these 5 sets. So we'll look at that now. And this is again from the sutra, the Satipatthana Sutra given by the Buddha. So he explains these 5 sets of phenomena. I'll just briefly mention them now, and then we'll focus on one of them, but we don't have time to go into all of them. So the first of the 5 sets is 5 hindrances. So these 5 hindrances are obstacles to the development of single-pointed concentration. Being able to focus our mind on a chosen object and keep it there without having it wander away. So there are these 5 hindrances that interfere with that. So we have to recognize them and learn how to overcome them so that we can develop concentration. And the second set is 5 aggregates. So we should be pretty familiar with the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, discrimination, abstract composites, and consciousness. And so the 5 aggregates are the basis in dependence on which we cling to an I, sense of I, me, mine, myself. And once we have a notion of a self, an I, then we generate various afflictions, like attachment. We get attached to whoever, whatever makes the I feel good, feel happy, and whatever makes the I feel not good or unhappy, we have aversion. We generate aversion and anger, hatred, and so on. So all these afflictive emotions come up once we have a sense of an I based on our aggregates. And also we generate various views about self, such as some people believe that the self becomes completely non-existent after death. Once the body dies, that's it. Nothing is left. No more self, no more I, no more mind. Just a complete end. So that view is called nihilism. But other people generate the view of permanence, where they think, no, there's a self or a soul that will continue to exist after death, and it will live forever and go to heaven or go to hell or somewhere else. So a permanent self or soul. So that's another view considered incorrect according to Buddhism. So both nihilism and permanence are wrong views according to Buddhism. And they all, they're based on a view of a self, an I, which in turn is based on the aggregates. So that's how the aggregates play an important role. So in the Satipatthana Sutra, the Buddha talks about contemplating the aggregates in terms of their nature, the characteristics they have, and also how they arise in dependence on causes and conditions, and how they disappear. And then the third set is 12 sources, and the reason they're called sources is because they are sources of consciousness. So every time we have a consciousness, a state of mind, a mental state, it arises in dependence on various factors, various causes and conditions. And the main causes and conditions for the arising of consciousness are the faculties, so sometimes called powers, like sense powers. So to have a visual experience, to be able to see an object, we have to have a functioning eye sense power, which is said to be a very subtle form somewhere within our eyeball. So that's one of the main causes or conditions giving rise to eye consciousness. And the same with the other sense consciousnesses, the ear consciousness, nose consciousness. They depend on a sense power, which is a part of our body, a physical thing. And for the sixth consciousness, the mental consciousness, it doesn't have a sense power like the others do, but rather it's the previous moment of mind, the moment of mind just before that is said to be the faculty or the power giving rise to mental consciousness. So the 12 sources are 6 faculties or powers. Those are necessary to have the 6 types of consciousness arising. And so that accounts for 6 of the 12 sources. And the other 6 of the 12 sources are the objects. So there also has to be an object to be able to have a consciousness and awareness of that object. Consciousness can never happen without an object. It always has an object. So we can't have eye consciousness if there's nothing to see. So there has to be a visual object, a visible object, and then the sense power, eye sense power, and those two come together, and we're able to have the experience of seeing, visual consciousness. So there's 6 types of objects for the 6 types of consciousness. So the 6 powers or faculties and the 6 objects make up the 12 sources. So these are sources for consciousness to arise. And it's important to understand that consciousness depends on these causes and conditions. Because once a consciousness arises, any of the 6 types of consciousness, there's always a feeling that accompanies it, as we looked at before, pleasant feeling or unpleasant feeling or neutral feeling. And the feelings, if we're not careful, can lead to afflictions. We see something attractive, we have a pleasant feeling, and then desire arises. We want more of that. Same with sounds and smells and tastes and so on. So the 6 sources then play a role in the arising of consciousness and what happens from there on, feeling and then afflictions and so on and so forth. And so it is important to understand this process and have awareness of the process as much as possible. Okay, group number 4, the 4th set is called the 7 awakening factors. Those aren't talked about so much in our tradition. They are mentioned in the sutra on the 10 grounds, and that is a Mahayana sutra. But they are talked about a lot in the Pali tradition, the Theravada tradition. The reason they're called awakening factors or enlightening factors is because they're causes for the attainment of awakening or enlightenment. So we need these. And I'll just mention the 7. They are mindfulness, investigation, effort or energy, joy, pliancy, concentration, and equanimity. And this group of 7 are also part of the 37 harmonies. And so we'll come across them later when we go through the rest. We're still on the first 4 of the 37 harmonies. But later, towards the end of the course, I'll kind of quickly go through the others. And that includes the 7 awakening factors, so we can look at them later. The last set, number 5, are the 4 truths. So we've heard those many times. Suffering or dukkha, and the causes or origins of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path that leads to that. So this list of 5 sets or 5 groups, it might look like just an arbitrary list of things, but there's actually a progression. There's actually a logical, meaningful progression through them. for somebody who wishes to follow the spiritual path towards enlightenment, or at least towards nirvana. So it's a bit like a map of the path. So with the first group, the 5 hindrances, we need to be aware of them. We need to have mindfulness of the 5 hindrances because they're there. We have them in our mind, and they interfere with our development of concentration. And concentration is very important. We need concentration to be able to progress along the path. So we have to clear away the hindrances to those. And so then, once we have been able to develop strong concentration, we can use that to focus on our 5 aggregates and understand the nature of our 5 aggregates. They're there. We have these 5 aggregates 24 hours a day, and we don't fully understand how they exist. So we need to concentrate on them so that we can understand them and recognize how they are impermanent, not permanent, how they are unsatisfactory and not super wonderful, pleasurable, fantastic, and then how they are selfless, how they are empty of a self. So those are the 3 characteristics that we need to understand with regard to the aggregates, and we need concentration to be able to see that. And then also applying concentration and mindfulness to the 12 sources, the next set, then we'll understand how they start a chain of events that leads to suffering. You know, they give rise to perceptions of visual objects, sounds, and so forth, and then that can lead to pleasant feelings or unpleasant feelings, which in turn lead to attachment and aversion and so on. So this is all part of the kind of web, net, keeping us in samsara. Buddhist texts often talk about restraining our senses. Yeah, especially in the beginning, we need to learn how to restrain our senses so we're not just constantly looking at things and hearing things and creating more opportunities for afflictions to arise and binding ourselves more strongly in samsara. So up until there, like the first 3 groups are phenomena that are more involved in our being stuck in samsara, being trapped in samsara, and we need to recognize those and learn to manage them to get ourselves unstuck from samsara. And then the 4th group, the 7 awakening factors, these are qualities that enable us to get out of samsara, to get unstuck and free of samsara and attain nirvana and enlightenment. So those are things we know we need to cultivate. And then when we have cultivated the 7 awakening factors, then we can penetrate the real essence, the heart of the Buddha's teachings, which is the 4 Noble Truths, 4 truths of Aryas, and really understand the truth of dukkha, suffering, its origin, and then achieve cessation of suffering and its origin, and follow the path leading to that. So I was thinking to spend some time on the first 5 of the 5 sets, the 5 hindrances, and I kind of thought we could do that tonight. We can do a little bit of it and we'll continue next week. So I made a chart, the next page, next slide, just to get started on this. So in our tradition, the Tibetan tradition, there's not a lot of explanation of these 5 hindrances. They're talked about a lot in the Theravada tradition, Pali tradition, but you don't find them mentioned in the Lamrim. But they are mentioned in the Bodhisattva vows. One of the secondary Bodhisattva vows, number 25, is to, we should work on abandoning these 5 hindrances. If we fail to do that, we are transgressing that bodhisattva vow. So to keep the bodhisattva vow, we need to know what they are so that we can work on overcoming them. And also, they are obstacles to concentration. So if we do want to develop calm abiding and then special insight, we need to learn about and overcome these 5 hindrances. So let's just look at them, and we can spend more time next week. But so the first one is sensual desire, and this is desire mainly for sense objects, like our 5 objects of our 5 senses. So desire for looking at attractive visual forms, which could include art objects, movies, TV, having beautiful furniture in our house, and so on. So having the desire to gaze upon and own attractive visual objects. And then sounds, beautiful sounds. So people get, we get attracted to music, attached to beautiful music, or whatever we consider attractive music. Everyone has their own taste in music. So beautiful sounds, and then odors, smells. People really like perfumey. Well, some people, I should say, not everybody. Many people like pleasant odors. And then tastes, that's a big one, delicious tastes. And then tactile sensations. So we like pleasant feelings with our body, not too hot, not too cold, just somewhere in the middle, comfortable temperature. And like soft things touching our skin, soft clothing, not rough and scratchy clothing. And being comfortable, having comfortable furniture, comfortable things to sit on, a comfortable cushion to sit on when you're meditating, and so on. So physical, tactile sensations, which also includes the sexual desire, which is probably the strongest desire that human beings can have. So this is very pervasive. In fact, the world we are in, the realm we are in, is called the desire realm. Not just, it doesn't include only human beings, but also animals, the 3 lower realms, in fact, and some of the Deva realms. 6 Deva realms are included in the desire realm. And the reason it's called the desire realm is because our mind is just so hung up on desire for sense objects, mainly for sense objects. But it can also include other things too, like reputation, praise, people liking us, approving of us, and so on. Fame, like, the 8 worldly dharmas. So desire is a huge problem when we meditate and find it difficult to keep our mind focused on the object that we're supposed to be meditating on, and it runs away again and again, keeps getting distracted to other things. If you check where your mind is going when it's not on the object of meditation, probably most of the time it's desire that's taking the mind away. Sometimes we might get distracted by objects that we're annoyed at, angry at, but that's probably more rare than desire. So it's a huge hindrance to concentration. And antidotes to desire, when we know, so we need to notice it, we need to recognize when it's there, and then apply antidotes. It's not going to go away by itself. It isn't just going to go away because we don't want it to be there. We have to use antidotes. So one of the best antidotes is impermanence, our old friend, impermanence. It's a great antidote for many problems. I find it's easier to understand than emptiness as well. Emptiness is so much more difficult, but impermanence is kind of obvious if you really think about it, really pay attention. So just contemplating that whatever object it is we're attached to or we have desire for, it's not going to last. It's temporary, transitory. So thinking about that, does it make sense to have attachment to it? To get all obsessed with it? To want it to be there forever and ever and never go away? It's like setting oneself up for disappointment, for pain, being attached to something that's impermanent. And then it's also helpful to contemplate the shortcomings of sense objects, how they don't fully satisfy us, and if we really look carefully, they're not that great, because a big part of desire is exaggeration. There's a lot of exaggeration going on, seeing the object as much more wonderful, much more beautiful than it really is. And so if you do a reality check and ask yourself, what is that object really like? What is it really all about? You can see that it isn't that fantastic. It does have shortcomings, faults, and isn't able to give you lasting happiness and satisfaction. So you could still, we don't want to go to the other extreme of having hatred, aversion for the object, but just seeing it in a balanced way. Yeah, it has some good qualities, but it also has some shortcomings. It's not that great, not that fantastic. So, and if you do have some understanding of emptiness, it can be helpful to bring that in as well. Like a simple way of doing that is to just check, does everybody see the object the same way that I do? Does everybody think that object is so wonderful and so fantastic and is really attached to it? So if you check, you'll find no, not everybody thinks it's that great. And some people might even feel aversion, disgust, or just neutral, just like indifference. Yeah, I can take it or leave it. So recognizing that, realizing that can kind of help you recognize, well, a lot of it is my own mind. My own mind is kind of tricking me into seeing the object in a way that isn't really true, because other people don't see it that way as well. So that can be very helpful. Yeah, just to recognize the role the mind plays, exaggeration, superimposition, and so on, adding more than what is really there. So that's what I call doing a reality check. Does the object really exist in the way that I see it? And also contemplating dependent arising, how that object depends on other things for its existence. Causes and conditions came into existence. Like if you're really attracted to a person, it can be helpful to think, oh, once upon a time that was just a little zygote in their mother's womb. You can't get too excited about a zygote, fertilized egg, or a fetus, or even a baby. I mean, babies are cute, but it's not quite the same as when they're grown up and all kind of made up. And so, just thinking about the process of how that object came into existence, depending on causes and conditions, and changing over time. And how made up of parts, that's also very helpful. Think about the parts that make it up. Kind of mentally take it apart and look at those parts one by one. And can you really find something there that's so attractive, so something to get excited about? So these are things that can be very helpful to decrease that kind of desire. But we have to do it. And so again, it's important to recognize that if we don't deal with sense desire, it's going to interrupt our practice of meditation and our ability to develop concentration, and concentration is very, very important. It's an essential part of our practice, of our path. So I think I'll stop there. That's enough information for tonight. There's a few minutes left if anyone has an important question you'd like to ask.
What's the difference between what we're doing in mindfulness of the mind when we're identifying like attachment or anger in our mind versus when we're looking at sensual desire and malice in the context of mindfulness of phenomena?
So what is the difference when we're looking at these under the third mindfulness of mind and under, so there's a kind of overlap. So when we're doing mindfulness of the mind and noticing the mental states, we're simply noticing if they are present or not. Is there desire, is there a mind with desire, or is there a mind without desire? So just noticing its presence or absence. Whereas here, under phenomena, we haven't gone into this more, but one pays attention to how they arise and how they can be removed. Later we'll get into that, but just the words the Buddha spoke about this, like with sensual desire. This is under mindfulness of phenomena. He says, if sensual desire is present in him, he knows there is sensual desire in me. If sensual desire is not present, he knows there is no sensual desire in me. And he knows how unarisen sensual desire can arise, how arisen sensual desire can be removed, and how a future arising of the removed sensual desire can be prevented. So you go beyond not simply noticing their presence or their absence, but you also learn to recognize how they arise, like going from a state where it wasn't there to a state where it is there. How did that happen? What made it arise? And then also how to get rid of it, knowing how to make it go away and how to stop it. So there's actually there's 4 steps that I'll go through later. We'll continue with this next week. And so it's kind of a more specialized way of looking at these states of mind than in the previous one, mindfulness of mind. Anyone online have a question? Rachel, is that it?
I have a brief question. I missed the 7th. I got 6 of the 7, but I missed one of them. So let me see. I have mindfulness, investigation, energy or effort, joy, concentration, and equanimity, but I missed the 7th one.
7th is equanimity. Okay, so it's mindfulness, investigation, effort, or energy. That's one. Joy. Do you have that one? Pliancy, concentration, and equanimity. So that's
I didn't
7.
have pliancy.
Okay, pliancy, yeah. Okay, so we could stop there and let's dedicate so feel joyful rejoicing that we spent this time. It's not easy to learn the teachings, to stay focused on the teachings. There's a lot of material there, but just making the effort to listen, to learn, even if we're not able to fully practice at this point in time, it's still beneficial to get the imprints on our mind and have the aspiration to be able to practice in the future. So do feel good about having spent this time doing this activity, and especially doing it with an altruistic intention, a bodhicitta motivation, for the benefit of all beings. So let's remember that and dedicate the positive energy, the merit that we've accumulated to enlightenment, the enlightenment of ourselves and all other beings. May it be the cause for all of us to reach enlightenment as quickly as possible, free of every suffering and cause of suffering, and fully developed in every positive quality and infinite peace and happiness. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel, bodhicitta, that has not arisen, arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Incomparably kind and supreme Tenzin Gyatso, the wish-fulfilling, wish-granting jewel, source of every benefit and happiness in this world, may you have a long life and all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three sublime ones, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. So thank you for joining.